I'm with Joan Sullivan, who I think is in the region of Rimouski, Quebec. Welcome, Joan.
Thank you, Claude, for the invitation.
Oh, you're most welcome. I've been looking forward to this. It's been a long time since I've wanted to speak with you about the things you do. And I want to just tell the story of I first contacted you, or at least first time I read about your work. You still write a column, a monthly column for the Artists and Climate Change publication, and I was really impressed by your writing and the issues and the way also every month you would develop your ideas about your art practice and the state of the world and so on. And it's sort of a parallel track to my podcast, and in a way it's like a public sharing of what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and you don't hesitate to say how you really feel, and nor do I. So that's I think that's part of trying to work our way through the climate emergency, is to be as honest as we can about what we're doing.
Absolutely.
So let's start with the way I often start is just have you introduce yourself, talk a bit about your background, how you got into art, because I know you have a science background, which is fascinating. Start there, and then we'll hear about some of your recent work, because that's also really interesting for me. So, Joan, who are you?
Well, I actually wanted to start by telling a story, because I think the story will help your listeners understand how I came to transition from 30 years of documentary photography to my new love, which is abstract photography about the climate crisis. So this is a true story. It really happened to me, and it's going to take about 5 minutes, okay? I think you'll see the connections to my past life as I go through.
I love stories.
Okay, good. And just sort of like as a feather in your cap, I've never shared this story in English before. I shared it in French at the end of a 2-year program at the University of Québec in Rimouski during our final colloquium. So it's been said publicly in French, but never in English. So here you go. It's New Year's Day 2020. Okay. I'm standing on the shores. I'm actually taking an afternoon walk along the shores of the St. Lawrence River. And in front of me, if you've ever been to Rimouski, you know that the St. Lawrence River in this part is no longer called a river. It's called la mer, the sea, because it's so wide. So I'm standing there on the shores of the river, and in front of me is this absolutely magnificent landscape, huge, big skies, kind of reminding me a little bit of my years in Africa. And there was no wind that day. There's no ice on the river. And the St. Lawrence was therefore like a huge mirror that was reflecting the colors of the winter sky, right into the water. You could hardly tell the difference between sky and water. And that particular afternoon, the sky was this profoundly deep orangey red color. And it was beautiful. It was breathtakingly beautiful. But at the same time, it was a beauty full of dread. Dread, because that river should be white. It should be full of ice. And it looked to me like it was on fire, okay? The same day, I don't know if you remember New Year's Day 2020, but when I woke up, the images in the papers and on the internet were these blood red skies in Australia. Okay, Australia was on fire. They later called it the Black Summer of Australia, and I mean these were like catastrophic ecological disaster in Australia. The whole forests were not just burned; they were incinerated. The animals, the kangaroos, the koalas, they were carbonized, and yet their carcasses were found on the fences as the animals tried to flee. And I was at the same time worried about my daughter, who still lives in Australia. So there I am, all alone on the shores of the St. Lawrence, and I'm thinking two sides of the planet. One is metaphorically on fire, the other is really on fire, and I'm all alone witnessing one single global catastrophe, right? And it was, I had a breakdown. I literally I broke down in tears. In French, I can say, je suis au bord du fleuve et au bord des larmes. Huh? It does not translate very well in English, but you would say, standing on the edge of the river and starting to cry. It's stronger in French. But the thing is, visually, if you're a photographer, the images would be more dramatic if I was in Australia. Those uncontrollable fires generated an avalanche of visceral images that I think are going to stay in our collective consciousness, for generations. But if you've ever stood on the shores of a winter river that has no ice, it's kind of, gray, right? That particular day it wasn't gray, but in general, a winter river is just sort of meandering through a grayish landscape. It's banal. It's not visually dramatic. And it occurred to me that very day that the worst possible thing is that it becomes normal to see a river without ice. It's becoming normal, and it is not normal. So I didn't know what to do. I'm all alone, I just take my camera and I tried to take a photo of this orange, metaphorically on fire river, but my hands were shaking. It was like click, 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 and each image was blurred, and I just deleted them all. So I started again. I tried to hold the camera, close to my chest to like steady it, and my hands were shaking. And it was the strangest thing. It's never happened to me in 30 years of photography, that I couldn't stop my hands. And it suddenly dawned on me that my hands were shaking not because of the cold, but because of an anger, this deep, profound anger about our collective indifference in the face of climate breakdown. We're just carrying on with our lives as if, la la la, and nothing's bad's happening. So there was this sense of rage. I mean, like, honestly, it's surprising how strong it, violent rage just sort of coming out of me. I wanted to scream. And I just, took my camera and I just moved it violently, right, left, up, down, and almost, I suppose it was almost like I was like drowning in the water. My arms were just doing everything. And I was holding down the shutter the whole time. 20, 30, 40 photos at a time. And I did it over and I was just beside myself. And, at some point you just stop. And, you're staring out at the river. And I just felt helpless. I just didn't know what to do. And then what happened next, what I was not expecting. It was a total surprise. I realized I needed to delete all those images. And before doing that, I just took a quick look at the screen, at the back of my camera. And yes, the majority were blurry and, they needed to be deleted. But there were a few that were just, that surprised me. They were like strangely beautiful. And it was like the digital sensor inside the camera was able to capture something intriguing about the chaos of climate change. And that thing that the camera captured was invisible to my eye. My eye saw fire, and but the camera captured there was a certain beauty and luminosity of the chaos, and it was inside the camera. And it gave me the feeling, as I move my arms, you sort of like, what you're doing is you're pulling light and you're pulling pixels across the sensor. And it looked like the light was liquid. It was just so surprising. And suddenly, and I'm sure you have had this experience, but for me it was the first time, suddenly everything just sort of like stopped. Whoa, what's happening? It was a very profound moment, and And I was speechless. And I was just sort of looking at this camera and then looking in front of me and then looking at the screen. And like, it was two different images, right? Completely. One was full of dread and then one was full of light. So profound. So I realized, I think later, it wasn't on the shore, but later, I'm trying to process what happened to me that day. I needed to stop, as a photographer, stop trying to control every single detail, every single element in my photos. I didn't use a tripod. I wasn't focusing on any one thing. It was just all movement. And I need to go more with the flow. As an artist, I need to just let go and experience it and embrace, let's say, embrace the unexpected. That's kind of what happened that day. And finally, I was still a student at the University of Québec in Rimouski at that time. And I realized, talking to some of my colleagues, that I just needed to dive into the chaos of climate change. To become one with the chaos, recognizing that I am part of climate change. It's not just me and then everyone else. We are all contributing in our own ways, and I needed to become one with. And hence, that's the title of my new project, which is Je suis fleuve. In English, you would say literally, but maybe not poetically, I am river, or I don't know how you would translate it, but je suis fleuve. Fleuve is the St. Lawrence River in French. It's just so beautiful. And becoming one with the fleuve. And I want to stop my little story there and cite Chantal Bilodeau, who Chantal is the founder of many things, but the one that I write for is called Artists and Climate Change, as you already mentioned. And she wrote an article in 2016 about theater in the age of climate change. And she said something really, really profound. And it stays with me. She said, this was in terms of playwrights, we need to stop making art about climate change, and we need to start making art that is climate change. And the is really important. That's the embodiment. We need to become, as artists, we need to become climate change in order to find new ways of expressing ourselves, so that maybe we can find a new way to connect with our audiences. And I spent 30 years documenting poverty in Africa and documenting the energy transition. And I always sort of felt a little, high on, how do you say that expression? Kind of a elitist approach that if I give people facts about the transition, facts about energy, they'll just magically, understand what I'm trying to say. And of course, after, I think I did wind construction photography for about 10 years. And I just suddenly realized I'm barking, I'll say it this way, I'm shouting into the wind. No one's listening. I have to find a new language. And I found that new language on New Year's Day, 2020, standing all alone on the edge of the St. Lawrence River. And for me, it's about not only becoming one with my subject, but playing with that tension between, the past and the future, between hope and despair, between light and dark. I'm much more focused now on that place in my artistic practice, and that's where I'm going to be hanging out for the next few years. It's a process. I'm experimenting. I'm not thinking about selling my work or who's going to like this work. I'm doing it because I need to do it. I've found my place, and it's the first time in 30 years I can honestly tell you, Claude, that I'm really, really loving photography. it's a gift. That's where I am now.
So, Joan, that's a great beginning of our conversation because you answered many of my questions and interests because I wanted you to talk about that embodiment idea. But if we can step back a bit so that just people know where you've come from. You've talked a bit about your time in Africa and this and that, but without going too much detail, because I always put notes in the episode notes, but I mean a bio, link to your bio. But just tell us a bit about your background and how you came into this work. You're obviously interested now in the notion of embodiment, but it's probably been with you all the time, and you were sort of going deeper into that space. But how did it all start?
Oh, Lord. Well, I have to say that I grew up in a very artistic family. Architects, photographers, dancers, cooks, singers, whatever. And when I got to the point of choosing what to study in university, I completely turned my back on art, and I chose the sciences. And although I don't regret that decision at all. In fact, I give credit to the fact that I had a master's in public health, which sent me to Africa in the late 1990s. And it was in Africa that I rediscovered, this interest in photography. My dad was a photographer, and there were cameras all over the house, so I never needed to go to school to study photography. It just sort of happened by osmosis, living in that beautiful home. But it was in Africa, big skies, which I alluded to earlier, very similar to this part of Quebec. Landscape, people, cultures, music. It was very stimulating artistically. And I had this desk job. I was a bad bureaucrat for the United Nations, and I don't know. I hung out long enough, but at age 50, boom! I just knew that I was much happier behind a camera than I was in front of a boardroom. I just couldn't do it. So, against the advice of everyone, friends, family, colleagues, you're crazy. You're crazy to leave this international career. What are you going to do? I want to become a photographer. But what are you going to photograph? I don't know. I just want to be a photographer. So we moved back to, my husband and my daughter and I moved back to Quebec. We lived in Montreal for a year. And during that year, we started looking for a farm. Let's buy a farm. So we found a farm in the lower St. Lawrence region, which is sort of halfway between Quebec City and Gaspé, on that peninsula that sticks out in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And neither one of Jean or I had any farming experience, but we became farmers. We're now actually certified organic garlic growers, and we're doing very well. Which means that in the summer months, I'm more of a farmer or a farmer's assistant, and in the winter, I'm free. So, I've been doing a lot of winter photography. In fact, I'm invited next month to as part of a roundtable discussion here in Rimouski to discuss with a sound engineer and a filmmaker how to capture sound and light, sound and images in winter. What are the challenges? So that's coming up next month. But I spend most of the winter walking around with my heavily dressed, thick crampons on the bottom of my boots. And I did a lot of wind construction photography in the winter as well, which was very exhilarating. I guess I've left out that chapter of my life. Yeah. After we bought the farm, I had a serendipitous meeting with someone on an airplane, and turns out he was the manager of a wind construction project about an hour from my home. And he hired me for 2 weeks to come and take some photos, which I'd never done before. And then that 2-week contract became a 2-year contract, and then another client. And then, it's just like snowballed. And for 10 years, I was the only, as far as I can tell, the only woman photographer in definitely in Quebec and possibly all of Canada, who was devoted 100% to documenting the energy transition. And it was a privilege. It was great. But you know what? One day I just woke up and I realized I was bored. I don't know if that's ever happened to you in your artistic practice, but I just realized I'd done 10 years of my life, and it was time for something new. But I didn't know what it was. And it was like 2 years later that I had this experience standing on the edge of the river in the middle of winter. Yeah, there was this 2-year period of a lot of doubt and questioning and what am I going to do? And, eco-anxiety. But bam, January 1st, 2020, a door opened and I just walked right through. And it just felt so natural. It wasn't planned. I never planned to become an abstract photographer. It was like abstract photography found me, through my eco-anxiety. It's a very emotional, sensorial kind of photography that I've never done. It's experimental. I don't know where it's going to take me, but I'm having a really good time. It's just been amazing.
Well, I'm having a good time listening to you speak about these things because it's you've had moments of darkness in your life in the sense of in your writings, talking about solastalgia and related issues, and we've corresponded about that. And I do agree that there's a collective indifference. I think of it as a type of denial or maybe a lack of empowerment. People don't feel that they have the agency to change. But you're working in the arts, so you're thinking that the arts can make a difference, maybe at a small scale, but perhaps also at a large scale. How do you see that? How do you see that the arts make a difference? They raise our awareness, of course, but how can the arts, they're transforming you as an individual, it sounds like, but what about your audiences and the public more generally? How can it have impact?
But that was one of the things I learned working on HIV/AIDS in Africa. We came with our scientific baggage from New York and London and Paris, and we all, meet up in Africa, and it's like, we know what these people need. We've got all the scientific facts, and if they don't listen to us, well, that's their own problem. It was really a very patronizing colonial sort of view of how to help slow down the epidemic in Africa. And I think it's the same with climate change. Increasing knowledge, I don't believe, is what we need to do. It's what I learned in Africa with AIDS, and there are, we could have another conversation another time. There are incredible similarities between the AIDS epidemic and the climate crisis. The way that, denial and governments, dragging their feet. Probably I should write about that someday. But anyway, trying to give people scientific knowledge about AIDS did not change behavior. And I think it's the same thing about climate. The more, and I was doing it for 10 years. I was trying to make people excited about the energy transition. But there's something cultural missing. And I think that's where artists need to focus on. And that's why I think the sense of embodiment, not only for me as an artist, but for the public. How do we get them to sort of feel it viscerally? I think that's our role. It's not about statistics and degrees centigrade and, doomsday scenarios in the future, and more reports, they're just getting more and more ominous. I think people are turning off. It's like telling someone who smokes to stop smoking, it's bad for you. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So I would argue that artists need to really look deep inside more of sort of, it's I think you had an interview with another person earlier. Sorry, what's her name? Shannon. What is Shannon's last name?
Litzenberger. Yeah.
That's it, Litzenberger. She said in the podcast that you had with her that art as a system of knowledge art as a way of knowing, and she talked about embodiment. I really think she's onto something there. And it's more about the practice, the artistic practice as a form of knowledge, not necessarily the result, what we produce, but it's that relationship. And in my case, it's becoming one with the chaos. That's worked for me. I'm not saying it will work for everyone, but the artistic practice is where we need to be looking at. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? And how does it make us feel? And in my case, it was liberating to embrace the chaos that is in front of me. Because earlier I was afraid of the chaos, and I would hold back and just photograph beautiful, wind turbines blowing in the wind. I don't think we need any more nice photos of wind turbines blowing in the wind. I think we need to go deeper, much deeper. And that's what will talk to people, I think. But
Ed, I agree with you. I'm going to play an excerpt of Shannon's podcast now, just so that people can be reminded of some of her own words.
I mean, I would first and foremost love to see artists really lean into experimentation with their creative practices and to share that what comes out of those practices, the learning and experimentation with each other. I mean, I think that's something that even as a community of art makers, we can get better at. But what that then also does is it starts to socialize learning about what art as a system of knowledge production is, right? And this is, I think, how we start to disentangle ourselves from the ways that we're trying to solve this challenge, or the ways that we're trying to, like, even thinking about what is happening right now as a problem to fix is maybe part of the dilemma to begin with, right? And that art as a way of knowing, I think, is so critical.
Now that we've heard Shannon, I'm interested in the idea of embodiment, because it's relatively new to me. Even though I've heard dance artists and other artists talk about it for years, there are different interpretations of it, of course. And you've explained pretty well what it's meant to you, at least in that pivotal moment in January of 2020. But okay, so let's say that artists do touch people outside of the knowledge transfer into more deeply into their emotions. Will that then change people's behavior? And maybe that shouldn't be the expectation, because what I'm hearing from you is that the process itself brings you into another state of being, of relating to the world, and then you don't know how you're going to change. You can't just say, well, I'm going to recycle more because I experience art. It's not that, nah. But there's a simplistic approach. And then there's this sort of grounded approach that we are artists in the sense that we are always sensitive. We are sensitive to what's around us, but sometimes we need people to help us access it. Like maybe that's what artists do. They bring us into experiences that we're already living, like your experience by the water there. So that's what I find is interesting as this whole thing. Like we're up to episode 95. By the way, today is December 20th, 2021. I always like to say the date. I've been doing 94 podcasts so far, and what you're saying today is not that it's new, but it's deeper. It's like evolving in my mind, in your mind, and hopefully in the minds of listeners. So thank you, Joan, for sharing your experiences throughout your writings and your career. But I'm also really curious to see what you're going to work on in the next few years, because you seem to be onto a path that feels very good to you in terms of a positive path forward and those kinds of things, because it can get pretty dark out there.
I started out as a documentary photographer. It was all about getting printed in magazines and online, and it was all about just the two-dimensional image. And I've just gone through 4 art exhibits in the last 2 years where your listeners can't see behind me, but 20 by 30 inch photos on walls inside of art centers and galleries. And as proud as I am of that, I don't think that I want to keep doing that. It's kind of like how I felt when I stopped photographing wind turbines. I will continue to work as a photographer, but in a sustainable art practice is printing my work, with all the inks and the glazes and the vinyl, and is that what I want to do? And I had a wonderful artist residency at a art center called Vaste et Vague. It's in Carleton-sur-Mer in eastern Quebec. I had that a few months ago, and that was where I came to the realization I need to stop. I need to minimize my ecological footprint of my artistic practice. So the future, I think, for me, and 2022 will tell, will be instead of printing my images and hanging them on a wall, I'm going to be projecting my images either directly onto the walls of the gallery or maybe even on diaphanous textiles, that are, I visualize it as hanging from the ceiling, but not attached to anything, so that they're kind of like, gently flowing with the natural air circulation of the room to give the sense of river, the currents of the river. And added to that, I want to add sound recordings of the melting ice. For me, is like a cry of the beluga whale. I want to add sound recordings to my projected images to create, I guess the word is an immersive experience for the visitors. So they maybe can have this embodied feeling, to be in the river, hearing the sounds, feeling the moving, textiles. That's where I want to go. And I hope that these textiles can be reused or recycled. I'm even thinking about printing on Braille paper, but I need to find a printer that can make it on large format Braille paper, which is hard to find, because it underscores the idea that we are blind. We do not see the changes in front of us. They are right there, and we're looking elsewhere. I'm going to be exploring in the next few weeks how to get access to some of this paper. So that's where I'm heading. We'll see. It's all experimental. It's not commercial. I don't know, who's interested in it, and it doesn't matter. I think that this is what I know that I can do to help someone else feel the urgency to act in whatever way they want. I'm not telling anybody what to do, but I just want them to feel to own the crisis. We are all part of the problem, and we are all part of the solution. How's that for a concluding remark?
Well, that's a good concluding remark, but I'm not sure I'm done yet.
Okay.
Because I do want...
Oh, go ahead.
No, but I think we're close, because you've basically presented the core of your ideas and some of your background, and you've talked about the role of art, which is something I've come back to many times, and people can make up their own minds on what they believe to be the role of art, but I keep exploring it and poking away at it, and every time people come up with ideas that I find refreshing, because to create art in isolation can be a very good thing. You step back from society, you create a work of art, and you bring it into society. But if we're actually going to be climate change, we sort of need to be in the front lines of society as well, right? So that's where the impact of the work is important, so that people can. And I've seen your photography, and I've really enjoyed it, because it's similar to my sound work, right? It's like experiential. It's trying to touch something that I can't quite explain, but through art somehow it makes more sense. Life makes more sense. So on another time, not today, I would love to go deeper into this idea that we are climate change. How can people approach that in a way that is, I wouldn't say celebratory, but certainly positive, in the sense that you want to feel what's happening to our planet, because not everything around us is bad, right? There is a lot of regenerative practices. There are indigenous knowledge experiences or processes that are coming back to our world, and so we kind of have to get through the collapse, because the collapse is almost inevitable. It's been baked in for years, and then what will come after and how will artists and cultural workers and people who have a sense of vision be able to contribute to that. I won't even call it rebuilding, because it's almost an absence of words. At a certain point, you get into this rhetoric about climate change and blah blah blah, and sometimes you just have to step back, stop talking, and listen, and try to feel our way through the complexity. I think that's what your artwork is trying to do, and I find myself in that headspace now. It's, that we're at the end of December. It's like the end of a long calendar year. It's been difficult with COVID. I want to recluse myself for a bit. I'm writing a radio piece myself that's about winter sounds.
Oh, I can't.
That will be the last
Maybe
episode.
we'll have to work together on combining your winter sound and my winter photography.
Yes, I've started recording already, and it's very exciting to be able to have that possibility. It's a homage to Mary Schaefer, a piece we first did in 1997. So it's called Winter Diary Revisited. But all that to say that it's good to keep these communication channels open, talking about what we're experiencing, like you've done in your writings, in your blogs, and in your artwork. Because I just find it breaks the isolation, and it opens possibilities. And I appreciate also the work you did on climate. On energy. I think that work is valuable, right? Because it showed us inside. I love seeing the workers, the real people in the field. We won't get into that so much now. But is there anything you want to end with? This will be the end.
Well, I do want to add one thing about those workers. Because my original attraction to the energy transition, I spent 10 years on construction sites. Okay, I was surrounded by dust and heavy machinery, and it was something I never had grown up with, and I was seduced by the beauty of those unbelievable long blades, white blades, blue sky, red crane, it was very geometric for me. But after, the first 5 years or so, I realized this isn't about machines. This is about humans. And I started calling it the human transition as opposed to the energy transition, because a lot of these workers were, not all of them, but some of them, and I think even increasingly more and more, used to work in the oil and gas industry. And they've left the oil and gas industry to build our future. And so I'm only alluding to this human transition because that's what's needed right now in this climate, not just for artists, but for everyone. We are entering, we find ourselves in a liminal space right now. And liminal space means it's that time between what was and what's next. That's where we are. It's a place of not knowing. And unless all of us humans, and not just artists, recognize that we are already in a transition, not just an energy transition, but a cultural, a democratic, a social transition, there is an end. We will come out of this. No one knows how, but we will pass through. It's inevitable. And what waits on the other side is up to us to design. So in our next talk, let's talk about liminality, transitions. I would very much like to do that because I've started reading more and more about it. I'm not yet up to snuff, but I think that will be our next conversation.
Très bien. Thank you so much, Joan Sullivan, for this, initial conversation, because I'm starting to have second conversations now. I've talked to Seth Klein, I've talked to Kendra Fanconi and others, because the purpose of this is for my own learning, but to share learning, and people evolve. Their ideas change. They refer back, so you can have a third part or a fourth part, as long as it's engaging for the listener, which I think it is, talking about our passion for art and culture, and our deep belief that it can make not only a difference, it's actually the path forward. Like you say, it's a cultural transition. And let's make or break culture, right? It's both making and breaking.
That's a great New Year's resolution. Okay.
All right, we'll
Thanks
stop
so
there.
much,
Thank
Bill.
you, Joan.
Bye-bye.